Man in Space, the 20th anniversary of the landing on the moon, is sponsored in part by Metropolitan Life and affiliated companies. Get Met. It pays. Following is a GGP presentation.
Good luck and Godspeed. 10, 9, ignition sequence start.
We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard.
The engines are on. 4, 3.
You could feel it shake because all this propellant was dropping down the line and going down. You knew you were getting ready to go somewhere.
2, 1, 0.
It's like it's a stallion ready to leap out of the starting gate. It's pretty alive.
We have liftoff. Liftoff at 7:51 a.m. Eastern Standard Time.
Suddenly it dawned on me that, my gosh, NASA's really serious. They're going to send us to the moon.
We don't have to stay here on Earth. We have a choice of where we want to go and stay.
Man in Space, the 20th anniversary of the landing on the moon. A Time television special.
Hello, I'm Alan Shepard. In July of 1969, 3 Americans lifted off in a Saturn V rocket like this one for a trip to the moon. Their flight fulfilled an ageless dream. Do you remember where you were when the Eagle landed, when John Glenn orbited the Earth, when Sputnik was launched? When we come back, we'll relive those historic and harrowing moments and look to the future of man's presence in space. Stay with us.
DGP's presentation, Man in Space, is being brought to you by your local Saab dealers, who invite you to test drive one of the most intelligent cars ever built. Buy the first Men on the Moon $5 commemorative coin. Order yours during this program. And by AT&T, the right choice.
This is Launchpad 5 at Cape Canaveral, Florida. Nearly 3 decades ago, I took off from here in a Mercury Redstone rocket. And I think some people remember Freedom 7 as the beginning of the space program. Actually, the evolution of the program goes back much further. It goes back to October 1957 and to an innocent-looking 23-inch sphere called Fellow Traveler. That's the English translation of the Russian word Sputnik. Now, while Sputnik itself was physically harmless, the news in November that 2 were circling the globe did some damage to American morale.
A multi-stage carrier rocket of a new design with foolproof precision controls put the satellite into its computed orbit, transmitting the now familiar beep-beep.
Sputnik's incessant beep and streak across the sky was an unremitting reminder that the Soviets were not just first. In the development of rocket power, they were best.
For the launching of the heavier Mutnik, as they've nicknamed it, means Russia probably has an operational intercontinental ballistic missile.
Sputnik was viewed as somehow a fundamental challenge to the character of the American society, that somehow because these barbarian, and I put that in quotes, Soviets had been able to achieve this remarkable achievement, it meant that the United States education system was corrupt.
Echoed in Sputnik's beep was an ever-growing public outcry for an American presence in space. Unable to ignore the hounding, in 1958, President Eisenhower signed an act creating NASA. Within months, the recruitment of the first U.S. astronauts began.
They had talked, I understand, about selecting deep-sea divers and all kinds of people have been accustomed to working in
in unusual and dangerous professions. And they decided, though, that the ones that were test pilots were the type they wanted for the astronaut corps.
When I was asked to join NASA in the Space Task Group, as we called it in those days, is this really what I want to do? Do I want to do this thing? Is it a stunt? I can recall very vividly as a child seeing this, I would say today even, an idiot in this white suit slide down this cannon barrel and get shot out of the thing into a net. And I said, this is what's somewhat similar.
But Wally Schirra, John Glenn, and the other men announced as the Mercury 7 would find being an astronaut was unlike any experience of their lives. Though the test pilots had demonstrated an unfailing grace under pressure throughout their military careers, not one was ready for an adoring public whose appetite for space travel had been whetted by comic books and campy B-movies.
But Larry, spaceships are dangerous.
The press picked it up, and they made us instant heroes. We hadn't even done anything yet. We hadn't even flown anything new. We were heroes before we even set foot in a rocket, let alone a spacecraft.
But the first man in space was Soviet cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin. His single orbit aboard Vostok 1 was yet another opportunity for Nikita Khrushchev to toast Soviet scientists, while their American counterparts, planning only a suborbital flight, burned with envy.
When Yuri Gagarin flew in space, the reaction on the part of the United States was one that we had to compete with the Soviet Union, and the United States announced its program to land on the moon, and was deliberately presented as being a part of a competitive effort with the USSR.
The United States responded on May 5th, 1961. The first American was launched toward the heavens. Navy Lieutenant Commander Alan Shepard was chosen for the job all 7 astronauts wanted, but no one else envied, to ride the Redstone, an adapted intercontinental ballistic missile.
It took a lot of guts for anybody to get up on top of a rocket at that time in our history. You got to remember that something like 30 or 40%, and sometimes higher, of the rockets that were launched from Cape Canaveral failed, and failed very disastrously. And so putting a man on top of a rocket that was designed to carry an atomic weapon was very dangerous and had to be done with a lot of risk.
I have the crews over here that I'm responsible for medically who are saying, give us a white scarf and a jock strap and we can go. You know, we're ready.
Freedom 7's flight lasted only 16 minutes, but it was the first giant leap championed in America.
What a beautiful view. Who are with us today, and this decoration, which is gone from the ground up.
The post-flight pageantry conveniently overshadowed the Kennedy administration's embarrassment at Cuba's Bay of Pigs. 3 weeks after Shepard's flight, the president focused on even more distant frontiers as he addressed Congress.
I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal, before this decade is out, of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the Earth.
Yes, we were a little shocked about going to the moon. But we did right away try to research whether the end of the decade meant 1969 or 1970.
I thought that was a very ambitious program, if we could do that within a decade. I was on the first orbital flight. Well, we were trying to define what man's limits were in weightlessness. It's quite a view from up there when from 160 miles up or so, you're looking nearly 1,000 miles each direction to the horizon out here. Good to be up there and have that kind of experience. Also good to be back at the end of the flight, too.
Glenn's 3 orbits inspired a surge of American affection for an aviator not seen since the journey of Charles Lindbergh. 3 years later, Gemini attracted less fanfare, but the program was a ladder of technical achievements.
It was the kind of program where you could build. You built in the Mercury to get man in space, and then Gemini You learn to maneuver and live for a longer period of time and rendezvous and dock. And you also stepped up to some of the new technology during the Gemini program that you'd need for Apollo.
EVAs or spacewalks captured the imagination. But Gemini's real breakthrough was proving two men could live and work as long as 8 or 14 days in a capsule the size of a Volkswagen Beetle.
I always summed that up by saying it was 8 days in a garbage can. I thought we were relatively clean and had kept things relatively clean until the next day when we went back and opened it up to get some books out of it, and it almost knocked me dead because it was really pretty bad inside.
Some critics decried Gemini's Flash Gordon stunts, but it paved the way for Apollo's lunar program. In January of 1967, Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee climbed in the command module for a routine test in preparation for Apollo's first flight, a mission that never flew. Fire in the command module claimed 3 astronauts as the first American casualties of the race to the moon.
The men who died here, Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee, were personal friends. And while their loss saddened all of us, the fire aboard Apollo 1 tested and then confirmed our collective resolve. We would go to the moon or literally die trying. Gus, for one, would have wanted it that way.
Do you ever think of the fact that you can get killed flying spacecraft? Well, we recognize that we can get killed flying spacecraft, but we have a job that is very fascinating and we're very interested in, and it's worth the risk.
I had a very close conversation with Gus Grissom the day before he did this test at the Cape. He had all these major discrepancies that had been piling up, and he knew needed fixing. But on the other hand, it meant a direct slip in the test program.
We had before us this message that we would do this by the end of the decade. The schedule was very much on everyone's mind. So, yes, there was probably a little too much of a hurry up. Perhaps a little overconfidence feeling. Maybe we were beginning to feel a little invulnerable.
There was too much combustible material within that vehicle. And it was an accident probably waiting to happen. You might say we were lucky that it hadn't happened before.
After the accident, NASA tested and improved the entire Apollo system, delaying the next flight for more than a year and a half. But presidential commitment to lunar exploration never wavered.
We will not surrender our station. We will not abandon our dream. We will never evacuate the frontiers of space to any other nation.
But while the goals were still clear, a series of hurdles remained. The first men to return to space were led by Gus Grissom's friend, Wally Schirra.
What we were trying to do with Apollo 7 was first get off a launch pad where we killed 3 astronauts. And I never forgot that. Gus Grissom was my next-door neighbor. I was the executor of his will. Betty lived right next door to us. So as a result, that was always in the back of my mind. I couldn't forget that. And I had to go through that routine for a long time. But I also said, let's get on with the mission.
After Apollo 7, 3 launches followed within 6 months, each a critical step in reaching the moon. The Apollo 8 astronauts were the first humans ever to ride the Saturn V rocket. The 160 million horsepower launch vehicle left a strong first impression.
You could stand and look down at the side of the rocket and see the vapors coming up, and it's almost like it was alive.
It's like being shot out onto the stage in a play. You don't walk out and the curtain open. It's like, boom, there you are, and suddenly you're in orbit.
In the boldest test yet, the crew of Apollo 8 flew 240,000 miles around the moon and back.
In the worst possible case, if we couldn't get an orbit from which they could return, they would be perpetually lost in space. And when you looked up at the moon, you'd always think there were 3 dead Americans. It would have been a horrible, terrible thing.
But the mission was most remembered for the Christmas Eve message it sent to a troubled world, which in 1968 was beset by violence. When the astronauts read Genesis, they briefly soothed the nation racked by war, assassinations, and civil unrest.
In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. And the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep. And the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters. And God said, "Let there be light." And there was light.
After we got back, I got one telegram that said, "Congratulations, Frank, Apollo 8 saved 68.
The following missions proved that humans could survive in space, completely free of the spacecraft's life support systems. And the lunar module, which Neil Armstrong found difficult to handle in the Earth's atmosphere, proved flight-worthy in lunar orbit. After the successful flight of Apollo 10, it became certain which crew would attempt to land on the moon. Commander Neil Armstrong, Michael Collins, and Buzz Aldrin became the crew that on the morning of July 16, 1969, would begin a journey into history. We'll continue with Man in Space, a Time television special after these messages.
T-minus 15 seconds. Guidance is internal. 12, 11, 10, 9. Ignition sequence start. 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. All engine running. Liftoff. We have a liftoff. 32 minutes past the hour. Liftoff on Apollo 11. Roger, we got a roll from Tower clear. Roger, roll. Apollo 11, this is Houston. You are confirmed to go for orbit. Roger.
The person you just heard was the Capcom, or capsule communicator. His voice came from this room, Mission Control at the Johnson Space Center. The technicians at these consoles controlled every heartbeat of the 6 million pound, 36-story Saturn V launch vehicle. In just 12 minutes after takeoff, they were communicating with a spacecraft traveling at 17,000 miles an hour in the weightlessness and blackness of space.
Houston, Apollo 11, this gave us a magnificent ride.
After the engine shut down, the voyage of Apollo 11 would be a 3-day coast through space. On board, the men were busy monitoring the capsule's life support systems and updating the navigational star charts. As the live television transmissions made clear, the weightless environment created unusual living conditions.
I thought we had amazingly good accommodations. We had hot and cold water. The food was even edible. We could comfortably have stayed there far in excess of 8 days.
The command module was a wonderful improvement over our previous spacecraft, which were really cramped. So we enjoyed the luxury of a big volume machine.
You realized right away that this was going to be a teamwork effort, and there was no secrets in that thing. And, you know, it's your bedroom, it's your office, it's the bathroom, it's the kitchen, it's everything.
It's a very playful environment, and you sort of have to focus to quit fooling around with it and just operate within it.
Like the ancient Archer for whom it was named, Apollo 11 hit its target from a distance of nearly 250,000 miles. By the fourth day of the mission, the 3 astronauts were 60 miles above the lunar surface, circling the barren globe at 3,000 miles per hour. Soon, the lunar module would leave the command module and its pilot, Michael Collins, behind, as Apollo 11 became 2 vehicles, Columbia and Eagle. The command module pilot, alone as the spinning lander departed, often found himself torn between duty and desire.
You can intellectually tell yourself, isn't it much better to go 8 miles from the moon than not to go at all? And the answer is clearly yes. But that doesn't take out the fact that you go to the moon, you want to walk on it.
July 20th, 1969. In a few hours, Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin would attempt to become the first men to land on another celestial body. Michael Collins watched as the fragile, ungainly Eagle left him behind and sailed on to the moon.
Roger, Eagle, done dock. Roger, how does it look? The Eagle has wings.
As the Eagle sped on to its destination, Houston's white team and its flight director, Gene Kranz, were in charge.
Okay, all flight controllers, go for landing. Retro.
Go.
Fido.
Go.
Guidance.
Go.
Control.
Go.
Telcom.
Go.
GNC.
Go.
Ecom.
Go.
Surgeon.
Go.
Capcom, we're go for landing.
Eagle, Houston, you're a go for landing, over.
The flight director is the ultimate boss. But what he has to go on is the tone of your voice and how you say something.
Does this voice sound like he's in control? Does he understand? Is there a question mark when he makes a phrase?
Kranz's judgment was soon put to the test when a guidance error was observed.
And then I said, flight, we have 20 foot per second error. It's down track. It should stay stable, I think. The landing radar came on, and sure enough, it fixed the problem. The error went right back to 0, and I was sitting there going, wow, we're home. You know, we're not going to have a problem. We fixed our big problem we're going to have.
1201. 1201. Roger, 1201 alarm.
1201 alarm.
Then Buzz called out 1201, which was a computer program alarm, and it was just sort of like a showstopper to me. I couldn't believe what I was hearing over the loop.
What happened was we had a switch in the wrong position. It was allowing data from the landing radar to come into the computer, and so the computer was functioning on a bunch of garbage coming in, and therefore getting behind in its computation, and therefore overloaded.
Neil and I are very thorough people, and we wanted to have everything working for us. So while we were doing power descent, we felt it was a prudent thing to do to have the rendezvous radar on, warmed up, and ready to be able to assist us in the event we had to abort.
Keeping both the rendezvous and descent radar systems powered up may have been a comfort to the men inside the Eagle, but the immense amount of data was overloading computer systems vital to a successful lunar landing.
It got tenser and tenser and tenser in mission control. And in fact, it was so tight, we were like a spring that was about to explode.
It was 26-year-old computer specialist Steve Bales who made the quick decision to ignore the alarms in spite of the danger.
This thing was just running by like a high-speed train. Your mind was going bam, bam, bam. It wasn't like we were thinking about these things. I was really wondering, you know, when is something going to happen that's going to stop us, because we're having too many problems. We're having too darn many problems was my thought, but nothing yet bad enough to make us stop. Then we started to have the problem with the fuel.
Well, running out of gas on Apollo 11 was a distinct possibility. We had mission rules that if we got to a low fuel state, we had a mission rule said it would be an abort, and I would call that as Capcom.
60 seconds. We watched 60 seconds go by, and we still weren't in the moon. We watched 30 seconds go by, and we still weren't in the moon. And we had started a countdown towards a either land now or abort now kind of call to the crew. It was very quiet in the control center at that time.
I was sort of keeping up a running commentary with all of the information that was being fed to me from the other flight controllers. And finally, Deke Slayton, the head of the flight crew team, said, "Be quiet, Charlie, let them land."
My task was to enable Neil to do his piloting task as effectively as possible. So I had to relay that information from the computer so he didn't have to divert his attention back and forth.
We had, in fact, simulated landing with very small amounts of fuel left, so I didn't feel that this was an oppressive situation. I think perhaps the final descent to the lunar surface was, for me, the highlight of the flight.
Going forward, drift into the right a little. Contact right. Okay, engine stop. We copy you down, Eagle. Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed.
I didn't have the luxury of seeing that. At one once-in-a-lifetime treat of landing on another celestial body had to go with me not paying attention to what was happening because my task was inside the cockpit.
When we ran the gas tank dry just as we landed, that was, you might say, perfect engineering, although it was emotionally not quite so perfect. It was a little hairy.
Our best guess is we had somewhere between 7 and about 17 seconds of fuel left at the time we landed.
I felt like we'd basically stopped breathing in mission control. And when I heard contact and engine stop, I knew they were on the ground.
We copy you on the ground. You got a bunch of guys about to turn blue. We're breathing again. Thanks a lot.
Charlie Duke's console was just behind mine, right over my shoulder, and I know he had to be looking at me, and I've always thought that I was the guy he was talking about, because I was turning blue, I assure you. I was absolutely elated.
This cheering breaks loose in the viewing room, and I, for the first time, realized, my God, we've actually landed the moon.
And return him safely to Earth by the end of the decade. Half of the great challenge had been met. America had landed 2 men on the Sea of Tranquility, and Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin marveled at what they saw.
Those first few seconds when Neil and I touched down and things were quiet and we gazed out the window and it was just a magnificent view.
All of us would love to have been in their place. I think there's probably at least 100,000 people who wish that, probably more. I know you had a control room full of them like that.
Anxious to explore this strange and beautiful new world, Armstrong and Aldrin asked for permission to skip their scheduled rest period inside the Eagle.
We didn't really think that with all the adrenaline running through us that we'd at all be successful in sleeping before knowing that whenever we got up we were going to go through the preparation activities to go and walk on the surface of the moon. I mean, no human would stand much of a chance of sleeping at all.
The 2 men prepared themselves for their great adventure. Neil Armstrong would be the first man out of the lander, the first man to walk on the moon.
Okay, Neil, we can see you coming down the ladder now.
Well, I think Buzz probably would like to have been the first guy on the moon, and so would 90 other people out there. There was an early draft plan where I think they did have it set up where Buzz could come out. But Neil was the commander of the crew, and it was his job to be the first guy on the moon, and he's the one that did.
20 years later, Armstrong still bristles at the suggestion that he pulled rank to step into history.
I had 0 input, no input whatever into that decision.
Okay, I just checked getting back up to that first step. I'm at the foot of the ladder. I'm going to step off the limb now. That's 1 small step for man, 1 giant leap for mankind.
The moment was important. The world watched it, which was absolutely incredible. Neil said what he wanted to say, and he is fully and completely responsible for it.
Well, actually, I didn't worry about it until after landing because I guess in my own view we didn't have that good a chance of completing a successful landing. But it was, I did think about it between the time of landing and the time when we actually exited the spacecraft. Buzz and I did that.
NASA's plan for the first moonwalk called for the 2 astronauts to spend more than 2 hours outside their lunar home. But as always, there was a contingency plan.
We decided the first thing we would do when we got out was get a grab bag full of rocks and dirt, and if that's all we could get, then we'd get back in the spacecraft and get the hell out of there, if we had to do it. On the other hand, if we had a little more time, then we'd put the instruments out, which we did.
Once Aldrin bounced down off the Eagle's ladder, he and Armstrong planted the American flag on the moon's crusty surface. They began to gather soil and rock samples and to set up seismic and solar radiation experiments. They wore protective suits which weighed 383 pounds on Earth, but only about 66 pounds in the moon's weak gravity.
Beautiful view. Isn't that something? Magnificent sight out here. Magnificent desolation. Isn't that fine?
I felt that actions in pictures were far more powerful than my crude ability to convey in words what the mobility was like on the moon. It's like a dog on a slippery floor.
You don't realize how small the moon is in comparison to the Earth until you get there. And when you stand on the lunar surface, you can see it curving away from you.
It's like much of the high desert of the United States. It's different, but it's very pretty out here.
It's very stark, but that's still very beautiful. And everything is so clear and so sharp. And it is not black, white, gray. You know, it does have color.
It was a stranger to me before the mission, but I now look back at it as somewhat of a friend.
Here, men from the planet Earth first set foot upon the moon, July 1969 AD. It came in peace for all mankind.
2 hours after stepping onto the moon, man's initial walk was over. First Aldrin, then Armstrong returned to the Eagle to rest and prepare for the blastoff, which would send them on their way back to the circling Columbia command module.
I enjoyed being in the command module by myself. It was a happy little home. All the machinery was working properly, and my concerns were not within the command module, but simply that something might go wrong with the LEM, with the lunar module, and these two guys might get stuck on the surface of the moon. That was my main concern.
Apollo 12 commander Pete Conrad remembers the nervous lunar liftoff anticipation of his crewmate and friend, Alan Bean.
I told him that he really shouldn't worry about it, because if it didn't light, then we became the first permanent monument to the U.S. space program planted on the moon, and left it at that.
You have a single engine to perform that task. The valves are redundant, the fuel is there, and you can get it to the engine several different ways. Nevertheless, that engine had to work.
And you're cleared for takeoff. Roger, understand. We're number 1 on the runway.
The Eagle's liftoff went flawlessly, putting it into a low orbit, allowing the ascent stage to catch up with the higher Columbia.
Very quiet ride.
Armstrong and Aldrin then climbed to a 60-mile altitude with the rendezvous docking with Collins. A short time later, the reunited crew slipped back behind the moon. There, out of radio contact with Houston, the all-important trans-Earth injection slingshot Apollo 11 homeward, back to Earth.
The moon is impressive, it's stark, and it's awesome in its austerity, but it's not pretty. Earth, on the other hand, is a ball of colors. When you look out in the background of space, the stars are spots of white light.
It was a jewel of blue and brown and white, and that was just hung in its blackness of space.
One critical step remained between Apollo 11 and the blue of Earth's oceans. A fiery re-entry through its thin protective atmosphere at a speed of more than 25,000 miles per hour. Floating down to the water with their billowing parachutes, the Voyagers of Apollo 11 were safely home. Their flight had proven that it was possible to leave this planet, to travel to a distant light in the sky.
I was one of 10 other Americans to walk on the moon in the 2.5 years following Apollo 11's historic flight. The last 3 crews were able to travel up to 5 miles from the spacecraft using rovers like this one. But by 1972, public support for traveling to the moon had cooled, and all other planned lunar missions were canceled as America asked, what next? When we return, we'll address the question that has haunted the American space program since the days of Apollo.
Back a bunch of rocks, we gathered some scientific data, and then we quit. And it was all over.
Apollo didn't give us the lasting sense of why we were in space. It was too much, too fast. And after that, we kind of fell in a black hole.
We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard.
Less than 10 years after a president's dream put 2 Americans on the moon, the vision and the dream were gone. Gone, too, was the money. the Apollo 17 crew left the last human footprints in the lunar dust, and NASA began looking for a goal it could afford.
The space program started as a political competition with the Soviet Union, having very little to do with the merits of being in space. And we found that that kind of motivation doesn't carry the program very far.
Ironically, the Soviets never did attempt a lunar landing. They chose instead to focus on other goals.
We tended to concentrate on long flights and on testing the capacity of the human organism to withstand lengthy flights in space, knowing that such lengthy flights would have to be made in the future.
In 1971, the Soviet Union launched their first space station. This one, called Mir, is their seventh. Like the Soviets, America launched its first space station in the early 1970s. Skylab was more elaborate than any of the 7 Soviet stations. It was also short-lived.
If it were up there now, it would be the biggest and the best. And for a few bucks, back in those days, we could have made it a reusable space station. We didn't do that, and it was lost.
All of NASA's money was being poured into developing the space shuttle. It became all the agency could afford. NASA envisioned the shuttle as only a part of a larger space transportation system. The plan included a space station, a permanent moon base, and the development of rockets that would carry astronauts to Mars by the early 1980s. The space shuttle was the only part of the plan to be approved.
The shuttle was a flawed, maybe a terribly flawed policy decision. The shuttle itself as a piece of hardware is something that one country should develop at some point, but the notion that it could be all things to all people, that it could be the single means of U.S. access to space, is a decision that will have consequences, I think, through the rest of this century.
Liftoff of the 25th Space Shuttle mission, and it has cleared the tower.
Flight controllers here looking very carefully at the situation. Obviously a major malfunction.
When we lost the Challenger, along with the astronauts and schoolteacher Krista McCullough, we lost our access to space. For more than 2 years, we depended on other countries to launch our satellites and commercial payloads into orbit. After the accident, another task force report on our goals in space included once again a space station and a manned mission to Mars.
I said, I've heard that someplace before. It seemed to me I heard it in 1964. So to me, we're 20, 25 years behind where we could be. We could have been to Mars in 1983. That's 6 years ago.
Tonight, I am directing NASA to develop a permanently manned space station and to do it within a decade.
In 1984, NASA finally got support for a second part of the space transportation system. This is animation of the space station Freedom. Many space experts say it is a critical step in expanding human presence in the solar system.
The station is indeed a logical step. It's a logical step in the outward movement of humanity off the surface of this planet. It's the place we go to space, not just to visit, but to stay.
We don't have this as a national project just to see if we can stay alive up there and return safely. The basic research that can be done up there, that's what's of value to every single American watching this program.
But even before its construction has started, the space station is in trouble. Congress is considering a $400 million cut to Freedom's $2 billion budget. According to NASA, that would delay its scheduled completion until late 1997.
Because of budgetary problems, we're talking about abandoning the space station, which is really almost insanity from my point of view. While the Japanese are already planning their own space station, the Europeans are also planning their space station. They're both cooperating with us on our own, but in case we drop the ball, they'll just go ahead with their own space station. And we'll be the only one, the only country in the world that doesn't have a space station.
Some space scientists contend that sending humans into space is an unnecessary expense, that we can be accomplishing more with robotic missions.
The manned missions are exceedingly expensive, but yet the yield from that is very small. So that I think the emphasis is quite wrong. The space station, which is a very expensive and very woolly-headed enterprise, has a definitely prejudicial effect on the really useful things that we can do in space.
The Soviet Union, however, has made a commitment to a manned presence in space.
Right now, miles above the Earth on a manned space station, experiments are being conducted that could cure major diseases, and new scientific data that could literally change the course of history are being collected every minute. Shouldn't we be there too?
This year, the Soviets have logged over 8,000 man-hours in their space station. Their cosmonauts are training for longer and longer missions. Their next destination, Mars.
Mars is the closest planet to us, and really the only one upon which there could be some traces of human life. And this is a subject which is of enormous interest, of course, to us. Human beings managed to get used to almost everything. We're very adaptable, and I think that we're going to be able to adapt even to situations that at first seem impossible, including a space flight to Mars.
Although the future of our own space program is unclear, some within NASA are already working on missions that go far beyond Apollo.
NASA has been given the charge to explore the options for sending humans to Mars, and to the moon, for that matter. And various parts of NASA are studying different components of the problem. What would be required? Mobility, spacesuits, spacecraft, life support technologies. The way a mission might evolve is you would launch from Earth orbit and coast to Mars, literally. You'd start off with a rocket kick that heads you toward Mars and then coast there. And it takes about 6 to 9 months to get there. You land on Mars, and you would have to stay there for time scales of a year to 2 years, because Mars and Earth just don't line up that often.
Our first steps beyond the moon will not be easy ones. Our unmanned Viking probe visited only a small area of the Martian surface, but what it found may make human occupation difficult.
You have to be cautious about dust storms and about the toxic properties of the soil if indeed it does turn out to be toxic, and you'd have to watch for solar flares.
Just the natural vistas on Mars, I think, would be tremendous. The canyons on Mars are immense. Some of the larger canyons are almost as long as the U.S. is wide, and very, very deep. The sky is pink a good bit of the time, maybe not too surprisingly. A lot of the dust content would make it that way.
In spite of all the difficulties, scientists from many nations are anxious to send people to Mars because of the clues it may hold about life in the universe.
If we find that conditions on Mars were conducive to the evolution of life and yet it didn't happen, that would say that maybe life isn't that common in the universe. On the other hand, if it turns out the conditions on Mars were not that conducive to the development of life and yet it arose anyway, that would say that life is very prevalent in the universe.
When you go explore another planet, try to understand its biological history, and you're faced with the lesson maybe of life having gone extinct on another planet, it's certainly going to reflect back in our understanding of our own planet.
We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon.
Ultimately, it will take presidential leadership and congressional commitment to guide our space program out of Earth orbit. Today, 20 years after we landed 2 Americans on the moon, NASA often seems an agency without a vision.
It's the future of the world. It's the future of young people. And yet we're robbing young people for our own lack of vision and our own lack of courage to set long-term goals and go for them. And for me, that's a real pity.
Without a vision, the Bible is very clear. Where there is no vision, the people perish. NASA, I believe, is a mission-oriented agency in search of a mission.
Travel arranged through Continental, with service to virtually everywhere man chooses to travel in the galaxy. Continental, working to be your choice to more than 120 cities throughout the world.
The quest to put a man on the moon, born from international rivalry and fed on the dynamic president's directive, culminated with 2 Americans walking on the lunar surface. The journey of Apollo 11 left us with more questions than answers. Scientific questions about our solar system, and also questions about ourselves. You know, in modern times, people often ask, if we can put a man on the moon, Why can't we do any number of simpler things? The true lesson of Apollo is that almost any objective can be met with the necessary commitment. The human will can carry us a long way toward whatever goals we choose. I'm Alan Shepard for Time Magazine.
Accommodations arranged through Hilton Hotels, offering double points to Hilton Honors members using the American Express card at participating hotels, only at Hilton. Man in Space, the 20th anniversary of the landing on the moon, a Time television special, has been brought to you by Apple Computer. Make your ideas fly with Apple Desktop Media. And by Raisinette, sun-ripened raisins in Nestle milk chocolate. Catch some rays, catch some Raisinette.